At a dusty auction in Oklahoma, laughter erupted when a crippled gray horse limped into the ring. No one wanted him. No one even cared. But when a teenage girl raised her hand, she wasn't just buying a horse. She was defying a town, a wealthy family, and even her own future. What followed was a battle against fire, cruelty, and doubt, until the most unexpected champion was born. The fairground dust rose in slow spirals, turning the late morning sun the color of old honey. Heat clung to the bleachers, to the rope rails, to the backs of people who'd learned to live with August in Oklahoma. You could taste salt and kettle corn on the air. Boots creaked on iron steps. A loudspeaker crackled with the auctioneer's rolling chant, numbers sliding into one another like beads on a string. Calves bawled on the far side of the grounds. A diesel generator coughed, and somewhere a boy laughed the wild laugh of someone who'd just learned he could climb anything. Sarah Miller sat 3 rows up, knees scuffed white beneath a borrowed pair of jeans, knuckles pressed against a paper cup sweating lemonade. 16, with the kind of sunburn that confessed a summer spent outside, she looked smaller than she felt, and older than she should. Her backpack sagged at her feet, heavy with a coffee tin, and 2 years of tips she'd folded into neat, imperfect squares after closing the diner. Beside her, Eli swung his heels and counted every chestnut and bay lead into the ring as if he were tallying stars. Their father, Daniel, kept to the shadow of the bleacher post, the brim of his cap pulled low in a way that said he trusted the shade more than he trusted a crowd. "They'll bring the good stock before noon," he said, without looking at her, the words carrying dust of their own. "Then we'll head back. You can help me with the axle on Henderson's truck." Sarah nodded, because nodding cost nothing. She had told herself she was here to keep Eli company, to sit on the edge of other people's money and watch its strange dance. But the truth was quieter. Auctions had been her mother's favorite kind of Saturday, before the long, dim months when color slipped from the house. Their mother would point out good shoulders, clean hooves, an eye that met you without flinching. She'd said horses remembered who listened. Sarah remembered that more than anything. Another horse circled in. A slick bay, neck arched, and mouth frothy with impatience. The bids jumped like sparks. A man with a bolo tie lifted 2 fingers, and everyone let him have the pleasure of pretending he'd won. Eli clapped. Daniel's mouth tipped at the corner with the ghost of amusement. Then the noise changed. Not quieter exactly, but meaner at the edges, like people leaning into a joke they hadn't earned. From the chute, a gray was coaxed forward, a dappled coat dulled by dust, a mane combed in a hurry, burrs still hiding near the withers. The horse put weight down on the left hind and then took it back, tentative, measuring, a question more than a step. The lead man kept his voice even and his hand light, as if embarrassed for them both. "Lot 42, the auctioneer sang, and his voice tried to cheer but turned brittle. 7-year-old gelding, broke to saddle. Good temperament. A cluster of men at the rail tisked as one. "Look at that hitch," someone said. "Waste of oats," said another. Close by, a woman in pearl snaps made a face the way you do at a dented can on a grocery shelf. Sarah didn't hear the words as much as she felt the space they made around the animal. It was an emptying out, a refusal. The gray paused at the center of the ring and lifted his head as if the sky could spare him a better answer. The left ear flicked toward the bleachers, then the right. His nostrils flared, tasting crowd and clover and diesel. He blinked, and in that blink Sarah saw neither apology nor plea, only a kind of steady, almost stubborn awareness. He did not cower. He did not perform. He stood there like a weathered fence post in the wind and allowed the day to know him. Her lemonade went warm in her hand. She realized she'd gone very still. Heat gathered in the crook of her elbows. A fly worried the air, and then thought better of it. The Gray's eye found hers. Not a trick of angle, but a line drawn true. A look that ran from him to her, the way a creek cuts between banks. It wasn't pretty or romantic. It was the recognition of something that had been overlooked too often, and had learned how to live with that bruise. "Don't look at me like that," she whispered. And Eli looked up, startled. "Like what?" he said. "Like he's trying to hold his breath until someone tells him he can stop." Her voice embarrassed her as soon as it left her mouth. Daniel shifted his weight. "Don't go naming anything," he warned softly, not unkind. He knew, maybe better than anyone, how names made anchors where there should only be passing. "You've got that enrollment deadline next month." The auctioneer called an opening number that would have bought 4 bicycle tires and a winter coat if they shopped careful. Nobody lifted a hand. A cough, a snort, a child whining for cotton candy. The man knocked the price down. And then again. The Gray shifted. Not from impatience, but from the math of comfort. Right hind, left fore, an adjustment that made the leg's shortness less a limp than a history you couldn't unwrite. "Where'd he come from?" Eli asked nobody, and a man behind them answered anyway. "Whitmore stock, I heard," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "They're clearing out their mistakes." Shame, but it happens mistakes. The word dragged behind it an entire language of dismissal. Cheap fixes, quiet sales, paperwork that said one thing when the barn knew another. Daniel's jaw hardened, a line of muscle naming each year he'd kept a small place alive on a mechanic's wages, and stubbornness. He had seen Whitmore men at the feed store. Their clean boots, their easy laughter, the way they leaned on counters like everything in the county belonged to their elbows first. He did not like hearing their name attached to anything his daughter had set her gaze on. The man at the lead clicked his tongue and asked the Gray for a trot. The horse obliged because he was polite, and because the body can be taught to try even when it hurts. The gait was uneven but honest. No head bob, no lunge against the bit. He moved like someone who had been made to carry more than he should, but had decided, in private, not to quit. A laugh pinged off the tin roof. "Good for the glue plant," someone said, and the meanness in it wobbled Sarah's breath. Eli flinched. Daniel shot the section of bleachers a look that would have stopped a quicker mouth. Sarah pressed her palm against the splintered plank beneath her and catalogued details the way her mother had taught her. The Gray's feet, hooves overdue for a trim, but not neglected past redemption. Shoulder, clean slope. Back, a little sway, nothing terrible for his age. The left hind, she measured the angle of the pastern with her eyes and imagined a band of cold water hugging tendon. Time, she thought. Time and care. Across the ring, beyond the rail, she saw Cole Whitmore for the first time that day. Hat tilted, a shine on his belt buckle that caught every stray photon. He stood with a loose-limbed certainty that said he'd never had to ask twice for anything. People orbited him like folding chairs around a campfire. He didn't speak. He smiled. It was enough. Next to him, a ranch hand in a navy shirt took a sip from a bottle labeled tea and watched the Gray with a boredom that felt practiced. The auctioneer shaved the number down to something dangerously reasonable and lifted his eyebrows toward the world as if to say, "Come on now, be decent." Sarah felt her father's caution arrive on her shoulder like a hand not quite touching her. She knew the ledger under the salt can by the stove held more red than black. She knew what Henderson paid for brake lines and what gas cost when the wind farm checks slowed. She knew the thin ache of a winter heater turned 2 clicks down to save. And still, the look. She had seen it once in a mirror, when grief had run the house like a stern ant, and she'd learned to make grilled cheese without burning the butter. She had seen it in Daniel, who stopped listening to the radio after dark because the wrong song would lay him flat. She saw it now in a creature whose ribs were a little too plain under a coat that should have had more shine, in a way of standing that said, "I will not ask, but I will accept." The chant dipped again. The auctioneer's ringman swept the crowd with an open palm, begging for a flick of fingers, a nod, a smile. A boy in a neon shirt sneezed. A couple in matching hats conferred, shook their heads, and moved toward the concession stand, as if kindness and corn dogs came from the same window. The gray lowered his head and breathed into the dust until it dimpled. "Sarah," Daniel said gently, visiting the name on her like a warning and a comfort. "We came to look." That's all she thought of syllabi she'd downloaded from the community college site and stuck with a magnet to the fridge. Of nights at the diner pushing a rag across a counter until the wood shone like a dark lake. Of spring storms that rattled the single-pane windows until she stood in the hallway with Eli and counted between thunder and flash. Of a small shoebox under her bed that had once held sugar cookies and now held bills, each one creased at the same place by the same pair of careful hands. The gray licked his lips and lifted his gaze again. It caught on her like cloth on a nail. There was an entire language in that eye, one that did not include pity or the kind of forgiveness that costs too little. It spoke of heat and fences and the way a night sounds when all the other animals sleep. It said, "If you are a person who keeps promises, I will learn your voice." Sarah set the paper cup on the plank. The lemonade had gone flat and sweet, as a secret you hang on to for too long. Somewhere a flag cracked in the wind. Dust traced the outline of her sneakers. Eli's hand found the hem of her shirt and held, the way a small brother makes a tether without knowing that's what he's doing. "I'm just looking," she said, though the part of her that mattered had already stepped over a line. On the loudspeaker, the number dropped again, the auctioneer's voice turning from sunshine to shade. The Gray's lead man made a last patient circle, one more polite trot, then turned his shoulders toward the gate as if to say, "That's all right, friend. We'll be on our way." Sarah leaned forward until the bleacher edge pressed a red seam across the back of her thighs. Her heartbeat lifted into her throat and hammered there, too loud for such a small thing. She did the math of savings and saw how quickly it unraveled at the tug of reality, and still the numbers fell into a shape that looked like a doorway. If she stood up, Daniel would know. If she stood up, Eli would be pulled along by love and worry both. If she stood up, the world would not become kinder, but it might become truer. The Gray turned his head one last time, a quiet crescent of motion. The moment held, like the fairground had somehow remembered how to be a church. "Don't," Daniel said, but he was not the kind of man to take a child's choice out of her hands once he saw it had already been made inside her. Sarah rose. The dust rose with her. The hat brims along the rail dipped with the shift of attention, following not the horse, but the girl. She smoothed the front of her shirt with palms that smelled faintly of dish soap and hay, and the metal tang of the diner's coin drawer. She picked up the backpack, and the coffee tin knocked against, the zipper with a hollow, honest sound. "Eli," she murmured, not looking away from the ring. "Hold on to my water." He nodded solemnly, and took the paper cup as if it were a relic. Daniel's breath went in and did not come out right away. Heat slicked the inside of Sarah's elbow, and somewhere not very far away, a bird cut the air into clean pieces. In the ring, the auctioneer sighed into the microphone and lifted his hand for the mercy of a final bid. Sarah stepped down the bleacher. The plank trembled, then steadied. She kept her eyes on the gray and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that something in the world was looking back without asking her to be more or less than she was. "Okay," she told the space between them, a word small as a seed and just as stubborn. "I hear you." The auctioneer's chant had dwindled into a tired plea, his gavel resting like a weapon he no longer wanted to use. The gray horse stood in the ring with his head slightly lowered, ribs rising and falling under the punishing sun, as if even the air had given up on him. No one bid. No one wanted him. And then Sarah's voice, small but firm, cut through the dust. 500? The crowd turned, laughter already bubbling up before the auctioneer could even acknowledge her. A girl, 16 at most, stood near the rail, her chin lifted higher than her father's hand that hovered uselessly at her shoulder. The paper coffee tin she carried knocked against her knee, as if reminding her of what she had just risked. 500? The auctioneer repeated, his voice cracking with disbelief. He scanned the bleachers, hoping someone else would counter, but the only responses were jeers. "She's out of her mind. Buying trouble? Couldn't haul him to pasture if she tried." Daniel Miller's jaw worked tight as a wrench. His cap shaded his eyes, but not enough to hide the fury rising there. "Sarah," he muttered, a warning thick in his throat. "Sit down." But Sarah didn't. Her hands trembled, yes, but she locked her gaze on the gray horse in the center of the ring. Shadow, though the name had not yet been spoken, looked back at her with the steady eye of one who had learned not to expect kindness. The auctioneer raised his gavel again. 500. Do I hear 6? 6 anywhere? Silence answered him. A cough, a snicker. A boy throwing peanut shells into the dust. "Going once, going twice, sold!" The gavel cracked like a gunshot. Gasps and laughter tumbled through the bleachers. Sarah felt the sound press against her skin, cruel and mocking, but she gripped the tin tighter. Inside were 2 summers of tips from the diner, birthday bills from her grandmother folded into corners, the scraps of her own future. She pushed the tin toward the clerk, each coin and crumpled note clattering onto the table like betrayal. Daniel caught her wrist, not hard but desperate. "That money was for school," he hissed. "Your ticket out of this damn dirt." Sarah swallowed, meeting his eyes. They were tired eyes, worn by years under hoods and engines, eyes that had once been bright when her mother was still alive. "I'll find another way," she whispered, "but he won't get another chance." Eli, wide-eyed and trembling with the thrill of it all, tugged at his father's sleeve. "Daddy, did you see?" She saved him. His boyish excitement rang like a bell no one could unhear. The handler led the horse from the ring, rope slack, hooves dragging. Up close, Sarah saw what the crowd had only ridiculed: the swelling along his left hind leg, the burrs tangled in his tail, the hunger etched into the hollows of his flank. He was broken, yes, but not beaten. She reached out as the rope was placed in her hand. The gray flicked his ears, nostrils flaring at the scent of her sweat, of fear and resolve mingled. For a heartbeat, the noise of the crowd dimmed. In that fragile silence, Sarah felt something shift. A pact sealed not with words, but with breath. The moment shattered when Daniel yanked her back. "We can't take him home. We ain't got room, ain't got feed, ain't got—" "We'll make room," Sarah cut in, her voice raw. "I'll work extra shifts. I'll cut back, You'll ruin yourself." His voice cracked, anger breaking against the rocks of worry. "You think life runs on promises?" Eli darted between them, his small hand brushing the horse's shoulder. "He's not scary," he whispered, wonder filling his tone. "He's just hurt." The gray horse blew warm air over the boy's hair, a sigh heavy with exhaustion. The crowd, already losing interest, drifted toward the concession stands, toward the real business of the day. But Sarah stood rooted, the rope burning a truth into her palm. This was hers now, her choice, her burden. They walked out together, girl, father, brother, and the horse no one wanted. The summer heat pressed harder, the dust thickened, and with every step Sarah felt the weight of what she had done settle deeper into her bones. She had traded certainty for hope, traded her future for a limping creature with nothing to give but trust. But when she glanced at the horse's eye, steady and unblinking beside her, she knew she would not undo it. Not for all the laughter, not for all the anger, not even for the promise of escape. The decision was reckless, irreversible, and it was hers. The drive back from the auction was the longest Sarah could remember. The road stretched endless and pale under the Oklahoma sun, each mile marked not by scenery, but by the silence inside the truck cab. Dust swirled behind the trailer where the gray horse rode, his shadow flickering across the glass when Sarah dared to look back. Daniel's hands gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles had gone white. The lines of his face, already carved deep by years of oil and grease and worry, were harder now, like stone that had forgotten softness. Eli sat between them, clutching the brim of a cap too big for his head. The kind of excitement only children can hold without fear of the weight behind it. He chattered about how they would build a new stall, how the horse would learn to run again, how maybe he'd even race one day. Every word was met with Daniel's silence, a silence thick enough to choke the air. Sarah sat pressed against the window, her reflection staring back at her. The coffee tin was gone, her future tucked into someone else's ledger. All she had now was the rope, coiled neatly in her lap, carrying the scent of the horse, dust, sweat, and something faintly metallic, like rust. She closed her eyes, feeling the rhythm of the trailer wheels beneath her, and told herself it wasn't a mistake. It couldn't be. When they reached the Miller farm, the place looked smaller than it ever had. The barn leaned against the weight of years, its roof patched in tin sheets that rattled with the wind. The pasture grass was thin, tired from drought, and the water trough sagged where one corner had rotted out. Daniel backed the trailer to the gate without a word. The horse stepped out hesitant, testing the ground, his ears flicking at the new smells. Old hay, the sharp tang of oil from the garage, the faint sweetness of Eli's leftover apple core tossed near the fence. He limped, yes, but he walked with the dignity of one who refused to crawl. Eli ran forward, his small hands clapping with joy. "Look at him, Sarah. He's ours." He turned to his father, eyes bright. "Right, Daddy." "Ours?" Daniel's mouth tightened. "Yours, maybe." "Not mine." He pulled off his cap, ran a hand through his sweat-darkened hair, then slammed the cap back on. His voice dropped low, the sound of a storm before it breaks. Inside. Now, they gathered in the kitchen, the horse's shadow still lingering through the open window. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee, long cold and fried onions from breakfast. The clock ticked loud on the wall, each second marking the gap between father and daughter. Daniel slammed his palm on the table, the sound rattling the salt shaker. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" His voice was rough, the kind of rough that came not from anger alone, but from fear dressed up as fury. "That money was your chance. Your mother and I—" He stopped, the mention of her name pulling the words into silence. He looked away, his shoulders rising and falling like he'd been punched. Sarah swallowed hard. "I couldn't let him go." Nobody else wanted him. He would have been— She faltered, unable to finish the thought. "He's a horse," Daniel snapped, eyes flashing. "Not your brother. Not your future. A horse that's going to eat up what little we have and give nothing back. He's more than that." Her voice trembled, but held. "He looked at me, Daddy." "He hasn't given up. I won't either." Daniel's laugh was bitter. Short, like metal scraping. "You think looks put food on this table? You think faith pays bills?" He pointed to the stack of envelopes by the fridge. Gas, electric, the overdue notice stamped red. "We barely make it now, and you just threw away your way out." Eli tugged at his father's sleeve. "But Daddy, Sarah's right. He's special. You'll see." Daniel turned to his son, his anger cooling but not gone. "Go outside, Eli." "But now." The boy hesitated, then slipped out the door, leaving the silence heavier than before. Sarah stood tall despite the shaking in her hands. "I'll take care of him. I'll work extra shifts at the diner. I'll feed him from my own plate if I have to. You won't have to carry this." Daniel stared at her, the fight draining from his eyes, replaced by something wearier, sadder. "Your mother wanted you to have more than this," he said, voice low. "She wanted you to be free of this place, of this weight." And now, he shook his head, unable to go on. Sarah blinked hard, refusing to let tears fall. Maybe this is what she'd want. For me to fight for something that can't fight for itself. The words hung between them, raw and sharp. Daniel turned away, his shoulders slumping, the fight gone out of him for now. He opened the back door and stepped outside, the screen creaking shut behind him. Through the window, Sarah saw Eli leading the gray horse to the water trough, talking to him as if he were a friend already. The horse lowered his head, drank deep, then lifted his gaze toward the house, steady and unblinking. Sarah pressed her palm against the rope coiled on the table. She felt the storm still raging in her father, in the town, maybe even in herself. But when she looked out and saw the horse standing there, broken, mocked, unwanted yet still proud, she knew. The storm was only beginning, and she would weather every drop of it, because some decisions, once made, cannot be undone. The news of Sarah's reckless purchase spread through the town faster than prairie fire on dry grass. By the next morning, people at the diner were already whispering, their words cutting sharper than the knives on the counter where Sarah usually worked her shifts. Old men shook their heads over black coffee. Ranch wives pressed their lips into thin lines, and farmhands laughed into their plates, saying she'd bought herself a problem instead of a future. The name Miller Girl became a punchline, and every chuckle carried the weight of doubt. But the laughter wasn't the worst of it. The Whitmores had heard. Cole Whitmore leaned back in his father's office chair, the leather creaking under the weight of his boots propped arrogantly on the desk. At 22, Cole wore his father's wealth like a crown he hadn't earned, and he wore it badly. His hat sat at a careless tilt, his shirt pressed too sharp for a man who never worked the land, and his grin carried the smugness of someone who had never been told no. His father, Richard Whitmore, had built their empire out of cattle, rodeos, and politics, his name heavy in every corner of Oklahoma. But it was Cole who made the family notorious in smaller, crueler ways, through games of pride, through the humiliation of those who could not strike back. When word reached him that Sarah Miller had bought the injured gray horse, one Whitmore stock had discarded, Cole felt a spark of rage disguised as amusement. "She thinks she can make something out of that wreck?" he sneered to his friends, a circle of young men who orbited his arrogance like moths to flame. "I'll make sure she regrets dragging our name through the mud." That evening, as the sun slid down behind the fields, a black pickup truck slowed in front of the Miller farm. Its engine growled low, headlights glaring longer than necessary. Sarah stood on the porch, a bucket in her hands, while Eli played near the fence with the gray horse, who nosed the boys' pockets for treats. Daniel worked in the garage, the clang of metal steady against the quiet. Cole leaned out the truck window, his smile sharp in the fading light. "How's the cripple, Sarah?" he called, voice carrying across the dusty yard. His friend snickered. "Bet he can't even walk to the fence without collapsing." Eli froze, his hand resting on the horse's shoulder. Sarah's chest tightened, but she didn't flinch. "He's stronger than you think," she replied, her voice steady, though her grip on the bucket whitened her knuckles. Cole laughed, tipping his hat back. "Don't fool yourself. A horse like that's a waste of hay. He'll drag you down with him." His words fell like stones, heavy with the casual cruelty of someone who had never cared what weight they left on others. Then the truck roared off, spitting gravel against the fence posts. Daniel came out from the garage, his face grim, his hands dark with grease. "Stay clear of the Whitmores," he warned, wiping his palms on a rag. "They don't forget. And they don't forgive." But Sarah couldn't forget either. The look in Cole's eyes, the way he had turned her act of courage into a joke. It lit something inside her. Not just anger, but resolve. She turned back to the horse, who had lifted his head as though he too had heard every word. His gaze locked with hers, steady, unyielding. The next days were marked by whispers and stares. At school, classmates passed notes and snickered, calling her the horse girl, with sneers hidden behind fake smiles. At the diner, customers asked about the cripple in the pasture, their curiosity sharp as knives. Even Grace, her one friend, warned her to be careful. "The Whitmores don't just bully," she said softly. "They destroy." Sarah brushed off the warnings. Every morning before school and every evening after her shifts, she went to the barn. She brushed the grays, tangled mane, cleaned his hooves, and whispered to him as though he could understand every word. She named him Shadow because he had followed her out of that auction ring like a ghost, because he moved like a fragment of dusk across the pasture, and because he reminded her of the part of herself she didn't show the world. hurt, but still standing. Yet Cole did not leave her alone. One night, a thunderclap of fireworks exploded near the pasture. The horse reared, slamming into the fence, eyes wild with panic. Sarah ran barefoot through the yard, calling his name, her heart pounding as she fought to calm him. In the distance, she heard the laughter of boys and the fading roar of a truck engine. Daniel fixed the broken rail the next morning, his mouth set in silence. He didn't need to say who was behind it. Cole's shadow grew longer over their lives. He spread rumors that Sarah had stolen money for the horse, that Daniel was too weak to control his own daughter, that the Millers were a family drowning in their own pride. His words slithered through the town, and people repeated them as if truth was only a matter of repetition. But for all the cruelty, for all the weight of doubt pressing in from every side, Sarah found her strength in the quiet moments with Shadow. She watched him place weight on his injured leg. Slow and cautious, yet determined. She felt his breath warm against her palm, heard the low rumble in his chest when Eli lay against his side, as though against a living wall. Shadow was teaching her what Cole could never understand. Resilience wasn't loud, and it didn't demand attention. It simply endured. One evening, when the sun dipped low and painted the fields in gold, Sarah stood by the fence, brushing dust from Shadow's coat. Daniel joined her, leaning on the rail. His face was weary, but his voice was softer than it had been since the auction. "You've stirred up a storm, girl," he said. Sarah nodded. "I know. Storms break things." "Or they wash the ground clean," she answered. Her eyes never left the horse, who flicked an ear toward her as if listening. Daniel studied her a moment, then sighed. "Your mother would have said the same." He pushed away from the fence, leaving her with the fading light, the horse, and a promise she had made not only to herself, but to something greater. The Whitmores had power, yes, but Sarah had something different, something Cole couldn't buy, couldn't bully, couldn't destroy. She had chosen to believe in what no one else would. And that choice, reckless as it was, had already begun to carve a path the Whitmores would never see coming. The first weeks with Shadow were a blur of exhaustion, hope, and quiet defiance. Every morning before school, Sarah rose while the horizon was still a pale bruise of dawn. She slipped into her worn boots, filled a bucket with water, and walked to the barn with the same determination she once carried to her textbooks. The barn smelled of hay and dust, its boards groaning with age. But inside was the beginning of something that felt bigger than the laughter she endured in town. Shadow stood waiting, ears flicking as she approached. He had begun to recognize her footsteps, the cadence of her breath. Though his body still carried the limp, his eyes no longer darted with panic when the door creaked open. Sarah moved slowly, brushing his coat in long, steady strokes. Burrs pulled free from his mane, dirt lifted in soft clouds. Sometimes she whispered to him, not instructions, not demands, but stories. Stories of her mother humming in the kitchen, of Eli's dreams to build airplanes, of Daniel's stubborn pride that she swore could anchor a sinking ship. At first, Shadow only listened. His ears tilted, his chest rose and fell, his weight shifting cautiously from one leg to another. But as the days passed, he began to lean into her hand, a fraction at a time, as if testing whether trust could carry his weight. Grace noticed before anyone else. She found Sarah one afternoon behind the barn, kneeling in the dirt as she wrapped Shadow's swollen leg with strips of cloth, soaked in cold water. Grace leaned against the fence, her braid slipping over her shoulder, her eyes wide. "You really did it," Grace said softly. "You really brought him back." Sarah didn't look up. "Not yet. But I will." Grace stepped closer, her voice hushed, as if not to startle the animal. "Everybody at school says you're crazy." "They say he'll never be more than a pasture ornament." Sarah tied off the bandage, smoothed it gently with her palm, then finally glanced at her friend. "Then they don't know him." She paused, her throat tight. "They don't know me either." Grace smiled, a small, loyal thing. "Well, I do. And I believe you." Those words settled in Sarah's chest, like a lantern lit against the dark. Grace never asked for explanations or demanded proof. She simply showed up, sometimes with books borrowed from her father's shelves, sometimes with an apple tucked into her pocket for Shadow. Together they would sit in the pasture after chores, Grace sketching in her notebook while Sarah leaned against the horse's side, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. Eli, too, became Shadow's companion. The boy would run barefoot across the yard, his laughter ringing like bells, climbing the fence to sit perched beside the horse. Shadow seemed to understand Eli's innocence, standing calm as the boy traced patterns in his mane or leaned his cheek against the broad curve of his shoulder. Once, Sarah caught Eli whispering to him, "Don't worry. We're family now." The horse flicked his ear, as though in answer, and Sarah's throat ached with a pride she couldn't quite name. But not all moments were gentle. The Whitmore's shadow loomed long. One evening, Sarah returned from her shift at the diner to find a crude sign nailed to their pasture fence. "Cripples belong in the dirt." Daniel ripped it down, his jaw clenched, his silence louder than shouting. Sarah saw the way his hands shook as he burned the wood in the fire barrel. He said nothing, but she knew the Whitmores had struck again. That night she sat in the barn long after Eli had gone to bed. The lantern light cast a soft halo over Shadow's face as he dozed. Sarah leaned against the wall, pulling her knees to her chest. "They want me to give up," she whispered. "They want me to think I can't change anything. But they don't know what it feels like, to be left behind." "You do." Shadow stirred, shifting his weight, then lowered his head until his muzzle brushed her shoulder. His breath was warm, steady. For a moment, Sarah closed her eyes and let herself believe that he understood every word. Days bled into weeks, and slowly, change began to show. The limp was still there, but the swelling lessened. His coat gained a faint shine. His ribs, once sharp as fence rails, softened under the steady care Sarah and Grace provided. Each improvement was small, almost invisible to anyone else. But to Sarah, it was everything. One Sunday morning, Daniel stood at the barn door, arms crossed, watching silently as Sarah led Shadow into the pasture. The horse stepped carefully, ears flicking at the wind, but his gait was steadier than before. Daniel said nothing, but his eyes followed every step, every cautious movement. For the first time, his anger seemed to falter, replaced by something quieter, something that looked a little like doubt. Sarah didn't call out to him. She didn't ask for approval. She simply walked beside Shadow, her hand brushing his shoulder, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and pride. Grace sat on the fence, Eli running circles in the grass, and for a fleeting moment, the farm didn't feel like a place of debt or ridicule. It felt like a beginning. As the sun sank behind the horizon, painting the sky in bands of fire, Sarah rested her forehead against Shadow's neck. His skin was warm, the steady thrum of his heartbeat grounding her. She whispered, "We're not alone anymore." And in that moment, with the world against them and the Whitmores circling like vultures, Sarah found her silent friend. The kind of friend who needed no words, only faith. Autumn crept over the Oklahoma fields, softening the hard heat of summer into something gentler, though the dust still clung to the edges of everything. Sarah rose before dawn each day, her hands raw from work, but her spirit sharpened by the rhythm of care. She had become a fixture in the barn, brushing Shadow until his coat shimmered faintly under the lantern light, soaking his leg in cold water, whispering encouragement in the stillness. Yet despite her devotion, progress was slow, painfully slow, and doubt began to shadow her resolve. It was on one of those mornings, fog rolling off the creek, her fingers numb from holding the bucket, that she realized someone was watching. A cough, dry and hesitant, broke the quiet. She turned sharply, heart racing, to see an older man leaning on the gate. He was tall but stooped, his shoulders bent by years, his beard peppered with gray. His hat was pulled low, his coat frayed at the cuffs, and his eyes, keen, tired eyes, studied the horse with a focus that unsettled her. "You're wrapping that leg too tight," he said, his voice rough with disuse. Sarah blinked, defensive. "I know what I'm doing." The man raised an eyebrow. "Do you? That horse doesn't think so. See how he shifts his weight? You're cutting off the blood flow. Pain'll linger longer that way." She bristled. Who was he to appear uninvited, criticizing her? "Who are you?" "Name's Harris," he replied simply. "Used to be a veterinarian before the world decided it didn't need me anymore." He stepped closer, his gait uneven, betraying a limp of his own. "And unless my eyes are lying, that gelding's tendon won't heal on pity alone." Sarah tightened her jaw. "I'm not asking for pity. I'm giving him a chance." Harris studied her a moment, then chuckled, a low, weary sound. Stubborn. Just like him. His gaze shifted back to Shadow, who flicked an ear as if acknowledging the remark. "You've got spirit, girl." But spirit without knowledge is like trying to mend a fence with string. Won't hold long. Sarah felt her cheeks flush. She wanted to defend herself, to insist that love was enough. But somewhere deep down, she knew he was right. The truth stung, because the thought of failing Shadow, of letting him down after risking everything, was unbearable. "Show me then," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "If you know so much, show me." Harris's eyes narrowed, testing her. After a long pause, he nodded. "Fetch clean rags and a bucket, and watch closely." That morning became the first of many lessons. Harris demonstrated how to wrap the leg with careful pressure, how to massage the tendon to encourage circulation, how to use cold compresses followed by gentle stretching. His hands, though weathered, moved with precision born of decades, and Shadow seemed to sense the difference. Less tense, more willing to stand still under his touch. Sarah watched, absorbing every detail, her mind racing with questions. Harris answered them in his gruff way, sometimes mocking her mistakes, sometimes offering rare praise. "You've got a feel for it," he admitted once, surprising her. "Not many do." Horses know the difference between force and understanding. In the weeks that followed, Harris returned, though never with announcement. Sometimes he appeared in the morning mist, sometimes at dusk, when the cicadas hummed in the fields. Always quiet, always critical, but always teaching. He told her about the anatomy of a horse's leg, about patience, about the delicate balance between pushing too hard and not. Enough. Daniel was wary of the old man at first, his suspicion plain. "Why's he hanging around?" he muttered one evening, watching from the porch as Harris showed Sarah how to check Shadow's hooves for stone bruises. "He's helping," Sarah replied firmly, "and I need his help." Daniel didn't argue, though his eyes held caution. Trust was not something he gave easily, especially not to strangers who carried their own shadows. Eli adored Harris instantly. "He's like a cowboy doctor," the boy exclaimed one night, mimicking the way Harris had crouched beside Shadow. Harris only grunted at the attention, but Sarah caught the faintest twitch of a smile beneath his beard. Despite his roughness, there were moments when Harris revealed pieces of himself. He mentioned a farm he once owned, a family he had lost to time and choices. He spoke of mistakes that had cost him everything, of a horse he couldn't save, of nights haunted by the sound of pain he couldn't silence. Sarah listened quietly, sensing the cracks in his armor. Shadow, too, seemed to listen, standing still whenever Harris's voice grew softer, as though the horse recognized in him a fellow survivor. Under Harris's guidance, Shadow began to change. His limp lessened, his muscles strengthened, his coat regained a healthy sheen. He no longer carried the look of an abandoned animal, but of one beginning to believe in the possibility of tomorrow. And with every step forward, Sarah's resolve deepened. She wasn't just saving him, he was saving her, pulling her through doubt and ridicule, teaching her the language of resilience. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Sarah leaned against the fence, while Harris adjusted the last of Shadow's wraps. The air was thick with the smell of hay and the distant smoke of someone burning leaves. "You've done good," Harris said quietly, surprising her. "Not many kids your age would give up everything for a broken horse." Sarah met his gaze. "He's not broken, just hurt. There's a difference." Harris nodded slowly, as if she had passed some unspoken test. "Maybe so. Maybe you're the kind of person this horse has been waiting for." Sarah felt a swell in her chest, a mixture of pride and fear. She glanced at Shadow, who stood tall in the fading light, his ears tilted toward her voice. For the first time since the auction, she allowed herself to imagine not just survival, but victory. The hidden mentor had found her, and together they had found something greater. The first fragile thread of hope, strong enough to withstand the storm still gathering around them. By late October, the evenings grew sharp with cold, and the Miller farm seemed to shrink under the weight of wind that rattled the loose tin on the barn roof. Sarah had fallen into a rhythm: school, diner, barn. Each day braided tighter than the last. On the surface, things looked steadier. Shadow's limp had softened to a manageable hitch. His coat gleamed with a sheen of health, and his eyes no longer carried only suspicion. But beneath the surface, wounds that couldn't be wrapped in cloth or soaked in cold water stirred restlessly. Sarah herself carried them. Every time she walked down the school hallway, whispers clung to her like burrs. The horse girl, crazy Miller. Notes were passed, laughter muffled behind raised hands. She didn't rise to it, but the words lingered in the hollow of her chest long after the laughter faded. At the diner, things were no kinder. Customers teased, asking if she planned to ride her crippled champion to work. A man in a sweat-stained hat once dropped a quarter on the counter and said, "Put it toward his funeral feed." She bit her tongue until it bled, wiped the counter, and moved on. Pride, she had learned, was not in the shouting back, but in the quiet endurance. Shadow carried his own unseen scars. Even as his body healed, he startled at sudden noises. The crack of a truck backfiring down the road sent him wheeling in his stall, sweat darkening his flanks. Once, when Eli dropped a hammer by accident, the clang sent the gelding rearing back, eyes wide, as if the sound carried memories too raw to be forgotten. Sarah soothed him for nearly an hour that night, her hand steady on his neck, her voice low and constant. "You're safe. You're home. No one will hurt you here." Harris explained it bluntly one evening as they worked in the dim barn light. "Pain ain't always in the leg," he said, tugging the bandage loose with careful fingers. "Sometimes it's in the mind. Hardest thing to heal is memory." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "Then we'll keep giving him new memories." But she knew it wasn't that simple, because shadows from the outside world kept reaching in. The Whitmores, especially Cole, made sure of it. He didn't always come himself. Sometimes it was only his voice carried by others. A neighbor would mention offhand that Cole had laughed about Sarah's pet graveyard horse at the feed store. A boy at school, eager for attention, would mimic Cole's sneer and ask if she planned to enter Shadow in a three-legged race. Even when absent, Cole's presence pressed down like storm clouds, heavy with threats. The night it became more than words, Sarah was alone in the barn. Grace had gone home, Eli was asleep, Daniel working late at the garage. The air smelled of hay and the faint sweetness of molasses she'd mixed into Shadow's feed. She was brushing his mane when the first firecracker burst outside. Shadow lunged sideways, nearly slamming her against the stall. She dropped the brush, heart hammering, as another explosion rattled the night air. Laughter followed. Sharp, cruel, unmistakably young men's laughter. Shadow trembled, whites of his eyes glaring in the lantern light. Sarah pressed her body against his shoulder, whispering urgently, trying to drown out the chaos with the steadiness of her voice. "It's okay. Easy, boy. They can't touch you. You're safe." The fireworks stopped as abruptly as they had begun, tires spitting gravel down the road. The laughter faded, but its echo remained. Sarah's hands shook as she stroked Shadow's neck. For a long while, neither girl nor horse moved. Two wounded beings clinging to the silence left behind. The next morning, Daniel found scorch marks by the fence. He said nothing, only set his jaw tighter than before, but Sarah saw the fury in the way he hammered nails that day, each strike ringing like an oath. Grace was horrified when she heard. "You should tell someone." "The sheriff, at least." "And say what?" Sarah asked bitterly. "That the richest family in the county scared my horse?" They'd laugh me out the door. Grace had no answer. Instead, she reached for Sarah's hand and held it. A silent pledge. Harris, too, noticed the toll. "Your shoulders are carrying more than one girl should," he muttered one evening, handing her a flask of water after another long session with Shadow. "But don't let their cruelty become your burden. It belongs to them." Sarah looked at the horse, who had finally calmed enough to take hay from her hand. "It belongs to both of us now," she whispered. Still, not all wounds were inflicted from outside. Inside the Miller household, tensions simmered. Daniel remained distant, his disappointment like a closed door Sarah couldn't open. Some nights she heard him moving in the kitchen long after midnight, the floor creaking as he paced. Once she caught him staring at the stack of bills by the fridge, his shoulders sagging under a weight she felt but could not lift. Yet even in that storm of silence, there were moments of grace. Eli made it his mission to bring Shadow small treasures: a shiny rock from the creek, a carrot smuggled from the kitchen, a feather he insisted was lucky. Shadow accepted each offering with quiet dignity, his breath ruffling Eli's hair. Daniel, though stern, sometimes lingered by the fence after chores, watching as Sarah worked. He never said anything, but once she caught him leaving an extra flake of hay by the barn door before heading back to the house. Sarah clung to those fragments. They were proof that beneath the wounds, hers, Shadow's, even her father's, something stubborn still lived. Something that refused to be erased by cruelty or doubt. On a Sunday evening, as the sun dipped into crimson haze, Sarah led Shadow into the pasture. Grace sat sketching on the fence, Eli chasing fireflies, Harris leaning against the gate with his quiet, watchful presence. Shadow limped, but held his head high, ears pricked forward toward the horizon. For the first time since the auction, Sarah allowed herself to imagine a future beyond mere survival. She pictured Shadow not just walking, but running, his hooves pounding the earth in defiance of every whisper, every cruel laugh. She saw herself beside him, not as the girl who bought a mistake, but as the girl who turned doubt into proof. But as the twilight deepened and the first stars blinked awake, Sarah also knew. The path ahead was still thick with shadows. Wounds unseen don't vanish. They linger, waiting for the right storm to bring them back to life. She pressed her forehead against Shadow's mane, breathing in the warmth of his coat, and whispered the promise again, steady as prayer. We'll heal together, no matter what it takes. The first hard frost had just settled across the Miller farm, tracing the edges of the barn roof with silver when the night turned against them. The air smelled sharp and clean, the kind of air that hinted at winter on the horizon. But beneath that crispness lingered something heavier, unseen, waiting. Sarah had worked late at the diner, her apron still faintly smelling of grease and coffee, when she trudged home beneath a half-moon. Her breath came in pale clouds as she crossed the yard, the barn lantern glowing like a small star against the dark. Shadow's silhouette moved inside, steady and patient, as though waiting for her. She felt a familiar surge of relief. Whatever the world threw at her, whatever the town whispered, she always found her center in that barn. Eli had fallen asleep on the couch with a comic book splayed across his chest, and Daniel was in the garage, muttering over the stubborn engine of a neighbor's truck. Sarah slipped into the barn quietly, humming under her breath as she checked Shadow's water bucket. The gelding greeted her with a low nicker, brushing his muzzle against her sleeve. She smiled, pressing her forehead to his, whispering, "You're doing so good, boy. We're getting there." The peace was shattered by the faintest hiss, a sound too out of place to ignore. She lifted her head, frowning, just as a flicker of orange danced along the far wall. For half a heartbeat, she thought it was lantern light. Then the smell hit her. Acrid, biting, smoke curling cruelly into her lungs. "Fire," she whispered, the word sharp with disbelief. The crackle grew louder, flames licking up the side of the haystack, dry straw igniting in hungry bursts. The barn filled with heat and smoke almost instantly, the glow spreading wild and fast. Shadow screamed, rearing back in terror, his hooves striking sparks against the wood. Sarah dropped the bucket and lunged for his halter. "Easy! Easy, boy!" Her voice was hoarse, nearly drowned by the roar of flames. She tugged hard, but Shadow pulled against her, eyes rolling white. The fire painted his coat in a violent glow, his body shuddering with panic. Outside, Daniel shouted, the slam of the garage door rattling through the night. Eli's small voice followed, shrill with fear. "Sarah! The barn! I've got him!" she cried back, though her lungs burned, her throat clawed raw by smoke. She pulled again, this time coaxing instead of yanking, her voice a thread of steadiness in the chaos. "Shadow, please. Trust me. One step, that's all. One step." The horse hesitated, trembling. His ears flicked at her voice even as fire devoured the rafters above. She could feel his terror, hot as the flames themselves, but she pressed her hand to his cheek, forcing calm into her every breath. "We're not staying here. Come with me." At last, he moved. One step, then another, the rope taut between them. She led him toward the open door as Daniel and Eli rushed across the yard, their faces ghostly in the firelight. The flames roared higher, a sheet of heat at their backs. Shadow lunged forward, nearly knocking Sarah off her feet, but she held on, stumbling through the doorway into the cold night. Daniel grabbed the rope, steadying the horse as Sarah coughed violently, her chest heaving. Eli flung his arms around her waist, his small body trembling. Together they pulled Shadow clear of the barn just as the roof gave way with a thunderous crash, sparks shooting into the sky like hateful stars. Neighbors came running, summoned by the glow that lit the horizon. Buckets of water were passed, hoses dragged across fields, but the barn was already a furnace. The animals were safe. Only Shadow had been inside. But the building itself was beyond saving. Daniel stood in the yard, his face streaked with sweat and ash, his jaw clenched so hard the muscles jumped. When the flames finally died to smoldering ruins, silence fell heavy. The crowd lingered, murmuring, their eyes flicking between the destroyed barn and the Miller family standing weary and smoke-stained in the yard. Sarah's throat ached from coughing, her hands blistered from the rope burns where she'd held on to Shadow. The gelding stood beside her, sides heaving, soot streaking his coat, but alive. Someone whispered, "Wasn't an accident." Another muttered, "Whitmore's been prowling again." The words traveled in low tones, weaving suspicion into certainty. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew who would set fire to a barn on a cold autumn night. Cole Whitmore's truck had been seen near the back road only hours earlier. Sarah looked at the smoking skeleton of the barn, her chest hollow with grief. Every memory, every moment of safety she'd built with Shadow inside those walls, reduced to ash. She clenched her fists. The pain from the rope burns nothing compared to the fire building inside her now. Harris appeared through the smoke, his limp more pronounced in the uneven ground. He carried 2 buckets he had clearly abandoned when he saw the futility of fighting the blaze. His eyes scanned the wreckage, then fell on Sarah, his face etched with something between sorrow and admiration. "You kept him alive," he said simply. Sarah swallowed hard, her voice ragged. "They won't stop." Harris nodded slowly. "Then neither will you." Daniel turned toward her, his eyes darker than she'd ever seen them. His voice trembled, not with fear, but with the fury of a man pushed too far. "They came onto my land. Endangered my family." He shook his head, fists clenched. "This ain't over." Eli clung to Sarah's side, his small face smeared with soot and tears. Shadow lowered his head, nudging the boy's shoulder as if to promise he was still here, still standing. Sarah lifted her gaze to the ruins, the night sky scarred with smoke. She had thought the fire would break her, but instead it carved something harder inside her. The Whitmores had tried to erase her courage with flames. All they had done was forge it stronger. In the silence that followed, as neighbors drifted home and the embers hissed in the cold air, Sarah laid her hand on Shadow's neck. His skin was hot, his muscles quivering, but his steady presence anchored her. She whispered, "They wanted to burn us down. But we'll rise from this." And in the glow of the ashes, with her family close and her horse alive beside her, Sarah understood. The fight was no longer just about survival. It was about defiance, about proving that no amount of fire, real or cruelly lit by men, could consume what she and Shadow had begun together. The morning after the fire, smoke still curled from the blackened ribs of the barn. The smell of charred wood clung to everything. The porch rail, the pasture grass, even Sarah's hair as she combed it back with trembling fingers. The Miller farm, once modest but whole, now looked like a battlefield scarred by the night. Shadow stood in the pasture, restless, his coat smudged with soot, his ears twitching at every sound. Sarah stayed close to him, brushing away the ash as though she could erase the memory of flames. Daniel moved through the ruins like a man searching for pieces of himself. He kicked at collapsed beams, pulled nails from half-burned boards, and muttered under his breath. Eli followed him silently, a bucket in his hands, though there was nothing left to carry. The weight of what they had lost pressed heavy on all of them. By mid-morning, neighbors began to appear. First came Mr. Henderson, the mechanic who owed Daniel more favors than he'd admit. He parked his rusty truck at the gate and unloaded a bundle of 2x4s. "Figured you might need these," he said gruffly, setting them against the fence before heading back for more. Then came Mrs. Ramirez from 2 farms over, bringing a basket of cornbread and a jug of coffee. "You can't rebuild on an empty stomach," she said, pushing the food into Sarah's hands before turning to inspect the damage herself. By noon, the yard was alive with people. Trucks pulled up, trailers clattered, voices rose over the ruins. Men hauled lumber, women set up tables of food, children carried buckets of nails like solemn little soldiers. It was as if the town, long cowed by the Whitmore's shadow, had decided enough was enough. Grace arrived with her father, Mr. Thompson, who ran the bookstore. He carried a box of tools, his quiet eyes determined. Grace went straight to Sarah, throwing her arms around her in a fierce hug. "We're with you," she whispered. Sarah pulled back, her eyes stinging. "Why now? Why all of a sudden?" Grace's father answered for her. "Because last night crossed a line. Folks may not have spoken up before, but fire changes things. You don't set flames on a family's land and expect people to keep quiet." He glanced at the others gathering, his voice steady. "The Whitmores don't own this town." "Not today." Harris limped in not long after, carrying a sack of tools older than Sarah herself. He surveyed the wreckage, his eyes narrowing. "Barn's gone, but foundation's still good. We'll rebuild stronger." His voice carried, drawing nods from men who had worked barns their whole lives. Sarah stood frozen at first, overwhelmed by the flood of people. For weeks they had whispered, doubted, mocked. Now they came with hands full of nails and boards, their silence replaced by determination. She felt a tightness in her chest loosen, replaced by something warmer, something like belonging. Work began with rhythm. Hammers rang, sawdust floated, and the sound of men and women working together rose into the air. Daniel tried to protest at first, pride stiff in his voice. "We don't need charity." But Henderson clapped him on the shoulder. "Ain't charity, Dan. It's community. Difference is whether you can give back when your turn comes. And we know you will." Daniel said nothing more, only picked up a hammer and joined the line. Sarah carried boards, her arms straining, sweat stinging her eyes. Each swing of a hammer, each plank raised, felt like a defiance written in wood and nails. She looked at Shadow, watching from the pasture, his head high despite the soot on his coat. It was as if he knew this barn wasn't just for shelter. It was a symbol. A promise that what was broken could be rebuilt. Children laughed as they ran errands with smaller loads. Women's voices lifted in song while they prepared food. Even Eli found his place, handing nails to anyone who needed them, his chest puffed with pride. The Miller farm, once so quiet in its struggle, now pulsed with life. By late afternoon, the skeleton of a new barn rose where the old one had fallen. The sun dipped low, painting the boards in amber light, as though blessing the work. Sarah stood back, her heart swelling. She had never seen her family's land look so alive, so full of unity. Cole Whitmore drove by once, his black truck crawling along the dirt road, windows down. He slowed at the sight of the crowd, of the barn rising again in defiance of the ashes. His smirk faltered as dozens of eyes turned on him, not with fear, but with quiet challenge. For the first time, Cole looked small behind the wheel of his father's power. He revved the engine and sped off, dust trailing behind him, but the spell of intimidation was broken. As night fell, lanterns were lit, and once the town shared cornbread and coffee under the stars. Laughter replaced whispers, and Sarah found herself standing beside her father, watching as Shadow grazed calmly in the pasture. Daniel cleared his throat, his voice rough. "Didn't think they'd come." Sarah glanced at him. "Why did they?" He studied the glow of the lanterns, the barn's rising frame. The neighbors gathered close. "Because sometimes it takes fire to show people what's worth saving." He paused, his eyes softening as they landed on her. "You were right to fight for him. Maybe I was the one too blind to see it." Tears pricked Sarah's eyes, but she only nodded, her throat too tight for words. She looked at Shadow, standing steady under the night sky, and felt the weight of her choice settle into something solid. The Whitmores had tried to break them, to isolate them, to bury them in ash. Instead, they had sparked a fire no water could put out, a fire of people standing together. And in that moment, with the barn rising again, and her father's words finally carrying a hint of faith, Sarah understood. This was more than her fight. It had become the town's fight, too. And together, they were stronger than any shadow the Whitmores could cast. The barn stood tall again within 2 weeks, its fresh lumber glowing pale against the weathered boards of the old house. Though the scent of char lingered in the soil, the new structure was a testament to something stronger than fire. It was proof of hands united, of a town that had finally chosen to defy the Whitmores. Sarah walked through its wide doorway one frosty morning and felt the difference in her bones. Where the old barn had been weary with years of use, this one carried the spirit of resistance, every nail and beam set in place by neighbors who had chosen hope over fear. Shadow seemed to sense it too. He stepped inside cautiously, sniffing the straw as though testing the walls, then lowered his head to the fresh hay spread in the corner. His limp was still there, faint but undeniable, yet his stride carried new weight. Sarah brushed his coat until it gleamed silver in the morning light, whispering softly, "This is yours too. No one can take it now." But peace never lasted long where the Whitmores cast their shadow. The announcement came at the diner, where Sarah was wiping down tables after the breakfast rush. A group of ranch hands stomped in, their boots scattering mud across the tile. They slapped a poster onto the counter for all to see. Oklahoma State Fair Rodeo Rehabilitation Showcase. Prize, $5,000 and scholarship. The words leapt out at her. Rehabilitation Showcase. It was a new category, designed to honor horses that had been injured or abandoned, now brought back to strength by their owners. Not speed, not perfection, but recovery. It was as if the contest had been made for Shadow. Grace snatched the poster before anyone else could crumple it with greasy fingers. "Sarah," she said, breathed, her eyes wide. "This is it. This is your chance to show them he isn't just a cripple." Sarah's heart pounded, torn between exhilaration and dread. She could see Shadow in the arena, his head high, his limp no longer a mark of shame, but of resilience. Yet she also saw the laughter, if he faltered, the whispers sharper than before, the Whitmores turning every stumble into proof of their mockery. That evening, she brought the poster home, unfolding it on the kitchen table. Daniel read it silently, his brow furrowed. Eli's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Shadow can win. I know he can." Daniel shook his head slowly. "It's not that simple, son. Competitions cost money. Travel, fees, feed. And if he isn't ready..." He trailed off, his eyes falling on Sarah, the unspoken warning clear. "Don't risk breaking more than the horse." But Sarah held his gaze. "He is ready. And even if he isn't, we will be. We've come this far. We can't stop now." Harris weighed in the next day when Sarah met him at the barn. His gruff voice carried no nonsense. "It's more than a show, girl. It's a test of everything you've done. The leg will always be his weakness, but weakness doesn't mean failure. You'll need patience, strategy, and trust. He won't win by force, only by heart." Sarah nodded, determination sparking in her chest. She would enter. Not just to win money, not even for the scholarship, but to prove, to her father, to the town, to herself, that Shadow's worth could not be defined by injury or ridicule. Word spread quickly. By the week's end, everyone knew the Miller girl planned to take her crippled horse into the biggest showcase in the state. The reactions were predictable. Some laughed, shaking their heads at her foolishness. Others whispered admiration, though too quietly to carry beyond their porches. And then there were the Whitmores. Cole cornered her outside the feed store, his smile sharp as broken glass. "So, you're gonna parade that wreck in front of the whole state?" he drawled. "Can't wait to see the look on your face when he stumbles." Crowds love a tragedy. Sarah forced herself to stand tall, her hands steady even as fury burned in her veins. "You'll be watching then," she said calmly. "And you'll see exactly what he's capable of." Cole's grin faltered, just for a second. But then he leaned close, his voice a low threat. You don't belong on that stage. Neither does your horse. We'll make sure of it. The words chilled her, but they also hardened her resolve. The Whitmores had burned her barn, mocked her, tried to break her spirit. Yet here she stood, with Shadow alive beside her, a town beginning to stir from its silence, and a new challenge that promised redemption. Training began in earnest. Harris guided her through careful exercises, walking Shadow over uneven ground to build strength, practicing slow trots that demanded balance, teaching Sarah how to read the slightest flick of his ears or tightening of muscle. Grace documented everything, sketching in her notebook, whispering encouragement when Sarah faltered. Eli cheered from the fence, shouting, "You're champions already!" Still, the road was steep. There were days when Shadow stumbled so badly Sarah thought her heart would crack. Nights when her arms ached from work at the diner and the barn, her body begging her to rest. But she pushed on, knowing the fairground stage waited, knowing the Whitmores watched. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Sarah led Shadow through the pasture. He limped, yes, but when she asked him to trot, he did. Not smooth, not flawless, but with a determination that mirrored her own. She felt his spirit surging beneath the scars, his resilience pushing against the limits of his body. Daniel watched from the porch, his face unreadable. For weeks, he had held his doubts close, but something in his eyes softened that night. When Sarah returned to the barn, sweat streaking her face, he said only, "Your mother would have been proud." The words landed in her heart like a spark catching dry tinder. For the first time, she felt not only her own faith, but her father's too. The fair was only weeks away. The stakes were higher than ever. But Sarah knew, with a certainty deeper than fear, Shadow was no longer just her reckless decision. He was her partner, her proof, her chance to show the world what could rise from ashes. The mornings grew colder as November pressed down on the Miller farm. Frost crusted the fence rails, and each breath Sarah took in the pasture hung like smoke in the pale air. She worked harder than ever, rising before dawn to stretch Shadow's leg, walking him through careful exercises, coaxing strength where weakness lingered. The rehabilitation showcase was only weeks away, and every step mattered. Yet beneath her determination, unease gnawed. Harris noticed it first. One evening, as Sarah cooled Shadow down after a long session, Harris leaned against the fence, his eyes narrowed. "You ever wonder where he came from?" he asked quietly. Sarah looked up, puzzled. "From the auction. Nobody wanted him. That's all I know." The old man's gaze flicked toward Shadow, who was grazing peacefully, his silver-gray coat glowing in the dusk. "Horses don't just appear at auctions, girl. They have stories, and some stories don't stay buried." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She had never questioned Shadow's past. It was enough that he was here, that he was hers. But the way Harris spoke made it sound like Shadow carried more than scars in his leg. The truth came out 2 nights later. Sarah had finished her shift at the diner late and walked home under the brittle stars. When she reached the barn, she found Harris waiting, his coat collar pulled up against the wind. His expression was darker than she'd ever seen. "I've been asking around," he said, his voice rough. "Your horse, he's not just some cripple cast aside." He came from the Whitmore ranch. Sarah froze. "That can't be right. They did," Harris cut in. "Cole used him. Pushed him too hard, too young. Tried to break him for rodeo stunts, showed him off at county fairs, rode him when he was still half-grown. That's how his leg got ruined. When he wasn't perfect anymore, they dumped him at auction like trash. Sarah's chest tightened until she could hardly breathe. The image flashed in her mind. Cole Whitmore, laughing at the auction, mocking her for buying a cripple, when all along it had been his cruelty that made Shadow this way. Harris's voice softened, though anger still threaded through it. That horse isn't just a victim. He's evidence of what they do when no one's looking. If people knew— Sarah shook her head fiercely. If people knew, they'd blame the horse. They'd call him dangerous, say he deserved it. That's how the Whitmores twist everything. She pressed her fists against her sides, trembling. But if Shadow stands in that showcase, if he proves himself in front of everyone, they won't be able to hide anymore. They'll have to see what they did. Harris studied her for a long moment, then nodded. You've got fire, girl. Just make sure it doesn't burn you, too. The days that followed were a blur of training, but the revelation festered. Sarah saw every stumble, every flinch, as proof of Cole's hand in Shadow's pain. Each time she brushed the scars along his flank, she imagined the whip that must have left them. And each time she looked at Shadow's steady eyes, she felt her own resolve harden. They would not let the Whitmores define him. Grace noticed the change. One afternoon she found Sarah pacing the barn aisle, Shadow shifting uneasily in his stall. What's wrong? Grace asked, closing her sketchbook. Sarah hesitated, then blurted out the truth. Grace's face paled, her pencil slipping from her fingers. So all this time, Cole knew. He laughed at you for saving him, when he's the one who— Yes, Sarah whispered, her throat tight. And if I fail in that arena, if Shadow falters, it'll prove them right. That's what terrifies me. Grace stepped closer, gripping her hand. Then you can't fail. Not for him, not for you. You've already carried him farther than anyone thought possible. That's your proof Eli overheard later, when he wandered into the barn with a blanket for Shadow. His small face burned with indignation. Cole hurt him? He asked, fists clenched. Sarah knelt, brushing his hair back. Yes, but we don't fight back with hate, Eli. We fight by showing the truth. Eli's eyes shone with tears, but he nodded. Then we'll show them. The night before Thanksgiving, Sarah sat alone in the barn, her lantern casting long shadows across the beams. Shadow stood nearby, chewing hay slowly, his ears flicking toward her every time she moved. She rested her forehead against the cool wood of the stall and whispered, They tried to break you. But you're still standing. They tried to bury you, but you found me. We're going to make them see. Not just for us, for every horse they've thrown away. Shadow shifted closer, his muzzle brushing her shoulder, his warm breath curling against her skin. The weight of his trust pressed into her like a vow. Outside, the wind swept over the empty fields, carrying the faintest echo of a truck engine on the distant road. Sarah straightened, listening. The Whitmores were out there, circling, waiting for her to fail. But now she knew the truth, and truth was a weapon sharper than any fire or rumor they could throw. As the lantern flickered low, she whispered again, steady as a promise. We'll tell your story, Shadow. On that stage, they won't be able to look away. December swept across the plains with a bite sharper than any whisper from the townsfolk. Frost glazed the windows each morning, and the Miller farm seemed wrapped in a silence that only winter could bring. Yet inside that silence, the rhythm of training went on. Sarah pulled on her gloves each dawn, her breath clouding the air as she led Shadow from his stall. The gelding's limp was still there, stubborn as ever, but his stride had grown more confident. The once hollow lines of his frame had filled with strength. His coat shimmered like tarnished silver in the pale sun, and his eyes carried a quiet fire that matched Sarah's own. Still, the weight of what she had learned about his past clung to her like a shadow. Every time Shadow faltered, she heard Cole's laughter in her head. Every time she brushed her horse's scars, she thought of the whip and the cruelty that had left them behind. The anger gnawed at her, threatening to consume the steady patience she had built with such care. One icy morning, as she guided Shadow over a line of poles in the pasture, he stumbled badly. Sarah's heart lurched. She tugged the lead too sharply, frustration cracking through her calm. "Why can't you just do it?" she cried, the words tearing out of her before she could stop them. Shadow jerked back, ears flat, his eyes widening with fear that cut her deeper than any wound. Harris, who had been leaning on the fence, let out a long sigh. "That right there," he said, his voice heavy, "is exactly what broke him before. You gonna be the same as them?" The shame burned hot in Sarah's cheeks. She dropped the rope, stepping back, her hands trembling. "I didn't mean—" Her throat closed. She looked at Shadow, at the way his body trembled, and the guilt nearly leveled her. Slowly she raised her palms, speaking softer. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean it, boy. I'm scared, too." Shadow's ears flicked, uncertain, but he did not bolt. Instead, he lowered his head slightly, his breath ghosting against her hand when she dared to extend it. Harris nodded. "You're human. You get tired, scared, angry. But a horse don't know your excuses. He only knows your hands. Make sure they tell the truth you want him to believe." That night, Sarah sat awake long after Eli had gone to bed and Daniel had retreated to the garage. The farmhouse walls were thin, the wind howling through cracks, but she barely noticed. She replayed the stumble, the fear in Shadow's eyes, and her own loss of control. It terrified her, how easily anger could undo months of trust. She thought of her mother then, of the way she had once soothed colts with nothing more than humming, how patience had been her greatest strength, Sarah whispered into the dark, as though her mother might still be listening. "Teach me to be like you. Teach me to hold steady." The next day, she tried again. This time, she didn't rush. She slowed every movement, let Shadow feel her calm before asking him to move. He hesitated, stumbled once more, but when she stayed steady, so did he. By the end of the session, he managed the poles, awkward but determined, his ears pricked forward instead of flat. Sarah buried her face in his mane, whispering with tears stinging her eyes. "That's it, boy. We'll figure it out together." The weeks became a balance of triumphs and setbacks. Some days Shadow carried himself almost proudly, his limp barely noticeable. Other days, pain flared and progress seemed undone. But Sarah no longer let fear rule her hands. Grace stood by often, sketchbook in her lap, murmuring encouragement. Eli played cheerleader, clapping wildly at even the smallest improvement. And Daniel, though still cautious, started leaving tools in the barn, as if silently admitting he wanted to be part of the effort. Then came the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope, the kind the postman usually dropped without notice. Sarah tore it open at the kitchen table, her heart thundering as she read, "You are officially entered in the Oklahoma State Fair Rehabilitation Showcase." The words blurred for a moment as tears filled her eyes. She had done it, taken the step from dream to commitment. Eli whooped and spun in a circle, nearly knocking his chair over. "We're going to the fair!" Daniel cleared his throat, muttering something about expenses, but his voice lacked its usual resistance. Grace hugged Sarah tight, whispering, "This is real now." That night, Sarah slipped into the barn and read the letter aloud to Shadow. He flicked his ears, chewing hay contentedly, as if unimpressed by paper promises. But when she pressed the letter to his neck, she felt the warmth of his body, the pulse steady under her palm, and she knew it wasn't just her victory. It was theirs. Of course, the Whitmores didn't stay silent. Word spread quickly, and soon Cole's sneers grew sharper. He paraded his own sleek stallion through town, boasting about the real champion who would put Sarah's crippled pet to shame. Once, he cornered her outside the grocery store, his smile venomous. "The crowd's going to love it when your horse trips in front of everyone," he said. "Better get used to losing, Miller." Sarah clenched her fists, but held her tongue. Harris's warning echoed in her mind. "Your hands tell the truth. Make sure it's the right one." Instead of answering Cole, she turned and walked away, her spine straight, her silence louder than his threat. Training intensified. Harris pushed her harder, demanding she ride Shadow in slow circles to rebuild his balance, then lead him through obstacles designed to test his trust. Every night, she fell into bed aching, but each dawn she rose again, her determination sharpening like steel in the cold. Shadow met her halfway, his limp no longer a defeat, but a defiance. Every step a declaration that he was more than what had been done to him. On Christmas Eve, the Miller family gathered in the barn instead of the house. Daniel had dragged in an old radio. Eli strung up paper stars, and Grace brought cookies wrapped in foil. They laughed, sang off key, and for the first time in years, the barn felt not just like a place of work, but of family. Shadow stood in the center, ears twitching as Eli draped a scarf around his neck. Sarah leaned against him, her heart swelling. She realized then that the showcase wasn't just about winning a prize. It was about proving to herself, to her family, to the whole town, that broken things could become whole again, that pain could be reshaped into purpose. As the old year slipped away into the new, Sarah whispered the words that had become her prayer. "We're not done yet, Shadow. We're just getting started." The fairgrounds loomed on the horizon like a dream half-formed, the banners snapping in the icy wind, the smell of fried food and sawdust already drifting through the air. The Oklahoma State Fair had arrived, and with it the rehabilitation showcase that had consumed Sarah's every waking hour for months. The day before the competition, she and her family trailered Shadow into town, the old pickup groaning under the weight of expectation. The fairground was chaos, trailers lined up like soldiers, horses gleaming under blankets, handlers bustling with brushes and tack polished until it shone. Sarah felt out of place among the gloss and wealth. Most of the competitors had teams of trainers, shiny rigs, and horses that looked as though they had stepped out of a magazine. She had one horse with a limp, a patched-up halter, and a barn coat that smelled of coffee and hay. But when she looked at Shadow, steady in the trailer, with his ears flicking calmly, she reminded herself, they weren't here to look the part. They were here to tell the truth. Grace stuck by her side, sketchbook tucked under her arm, wide-eyed at the spectacle. Eli darted around like a spark, pointing at everything with boyish wonder. Daniel walked with a stiffness that betrayed nerves he wouldn't voice, his jaw clenched as he scanned the crowds. Harris came last, limping heavily, his gaze sharp as a hawk's as he sized up the field. "Lot of fine horses," he muttered, "but none with more to prove than yours." Cole Whitmore made his entrance just as they unloaded Shadow. His black truck gleamed, his stallion polished to perfection, a team of handlers bustling around him. Cole himself wore a smile sharp enough to cut glass. He spotted Sarah instantly, striding over with his easy arrogance. "Look at that," he drawled loudly, so half the competitors nearby turned to listen. "The Miller girl brought her charity case." "Brave of you, Sarah. Really brave. Shame it'll end in front of a crowd." Sarah's cheeks burned, but she met his gaze head-on. "We'll see who ends up ashamed," she said quietly, steady as steel. Cole laughed, clapping one of his friends on the shoulder. "You hear that? She thinks her three-legged wonder can stand against trained champions. Tomorrow's going to be entertaining." He tipped his hat mockingly and sauntered away, his laughter leaving a sour taste in the air. That evening, after the stalls were settled and the bustle of the fair quieted, Sarah stayed behind with Shadow. The arena was empty now, just rows of wooden bleachers waiting for the crowds, the dirt ring raked smooth under the floodlights. The silence was heavy, charged, as if the air itself was waiting. She led Shadow into the ring, letting him walk slowly, his limp faint but present. The sound of his hooves echoed in the emptiness, each step a reminder of the long road that had brought them here. She thought of the auction, the laughter, the fire, the whispers in town. She thought of her father's disappointment, of Harris's gruff lessons, of Grace's unwavering belief, of Eli's childlike faith. Every scar, every stumble, every moment of doubt had led to this ring. Shadow stopped in the center, lifting his head, ears pricked toward the stands, as though he sensed the ghosts of tomorrow's crowd. Sarah stroked his neck, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Tomorrow they'll all be watching. But it's not about them. It's about us. About proving that broken doesn't mean finished." The gelding snorted softly, breath clouding in the cold air. Sarah closed her eyes, pressing her forehead against his mane, letting the warmth of his body steady her. She thought of her mother then, imagined her voice carried in the wind. "Hold steady, Sarah. Hold steady." Later, back at the motel where they were staying, the family gathered in the cramped room. Eli was buzzing with excitement, chattering about how Shadow would blow them all away. Grace sat cross-legged on the bed, sketching Shadow under the bright arena lights. Daniel paced near the window, his silence louder than words. At last, he stopped, looking at his daughter. "You've carried this farther than I ever thought possible," he said, his voice low. "I don't know what tomorrow brings, but whatever happens, I want you to know I'm proud." The words broke something loose in Sarah's chest. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Harris grunted from his chair in the corner. "Pride's fine. But tomorrow, keep your hands steady and your heart calm. The rest'll follow." That night, sleep came in fragments. Sarah lay awake, listening to the hum of the heater, the distant sound of trucks passing on the highway. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the arena, the crowd, Cole's smirk. Fear gnawed at her, but beneath it pulsed something stronger, the steady rhythm of Shadow's heart, the bond that no fire, no cruelty, no mockery had broken. When dawn finally crept through the thin motel curtains, Sarah rose quietly, pulling on her worn boots. She stood at the window, watching the horizon blush with light, and whispered into the stillness, "Today, we show them." Outside, the fairgrounds waited. The storm had not yet broken, but its weight hung in the air. And Sarah Miller, with her horse beside her, was ready to face it. The morning of the showcase broke cold and brilliant, the fairgrounds humming like a restless hive. Trucks rolled in, trailers rattled, the air alive with the scents of leather polish, hay, and frying food from the vendors setting up their stalls. The grandstands filled quickly, families bundled in coats, children tugging at balloons, ranchers leaning on the rails with coffee steaming in their gloved hands. Above them all, banners snapped in the wind. Oklahoma State Fair Rodeo, Rehabilitation Showcase. Back in the barns, Sarah brushed Shadow's coat until it glowed silver under the flickering fluorescent lights. He stood quietly, ears twitching at the bustle outside, his muscles taut with anticipation. His limp was still there, faint but undeniable, yet his spirit burned steady. Sarah pressed her cheek against his neck, inhaling the familiar scent of hay and horse sweat. "This is our day," she whispered. "Not theirs. Not anyone else's." Ours Daniel paced near the stall door, his jaw tight, hands shoved deep in his pockets. Harris leaned against the post, his eyes sharp, his voice low. "Keep your hands calm. Nerves travel straight down the rope. He trusts you. Don't betray that now." Grace sketched furiously, trying to capture every detail, while Eli bounced in place, nearly bursting with excitement. "You're gonna show them, Sarah. You and Shadow are champions already." When the announcer's voice boomed over the loudspeakers, the crowd roared in response. The first few entries were polished, horses gleaming, handlers dressed crisp in shirts embroidered with ranch names. Each horse trotted, cantered, and bowed under the weight of applause, their recoveries impressive but predictable. Sarah watched from the chute, her stomach twisting. They all looked perfect. Shadow was not perfect. He was scarred, uneven, stubborn. And yet, she reminded herself, that was the point. Then came Cole Whitmore. His stallion strutted into the arena, muscles rippling, mane braided with ribbons that gleamed in the sunlight. Cole sat tall in the saddle, his hat tipped just so, smiling as though the stage had been built for him alone. The crowd cheered louder than they had for anyone else, and Cole basked in it, his arrogance shining brighter than the silver buckle at his waist. He ran his horse through the course flawlessly, each movement sharp, precise, rehearsed. When he finished, he tipped his hat to the stands, soaking in their adoration. Sarah's chest tightened. How could Shadow stand against that? She reached for the rope, her hands trembling. Harris's voice cut through the noise. "Don't look at him. Look at your horse. He's your proof, not them." The announcer called her name, and suddenly it was her turn. The crowd quieted, a murmur rippling through as Shadow stepped into the arena. Gasps echoed from the stands when they saw the limp, the scars along his flank, the imperfection laid bare under the spotlight. Sarah heard the whispers. "That's the Miller girl's horse? He can barely walk." Somewhere in the crowd, Cole laughed, loud enough to carry. Sarah lifted her chin. She led Shadow forward, her voice steady though her heart thundered. "Easy, boy." Just like home. The course stretched before them. Poles to weave through, a shallow ditch to cross, a small ramp leading to a platform. Shadow hesitated at the first obstacle, ears flicking nervously at the noise from the crowd. Sarah pressed her hand against his neck, whispering, "It's just us. Forget them." One step. He moved, slow but sure, weaving awkwardly between the poles. The limp showed, but so did his determination. The crowd fell silent, watching. At the ditch, he balked, shifting his weight uncertainly. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering every night in the pasture, every whispered promise. She leaned close. "Trust me." Shadow leapt, not gracefully, not smoothly, but with heart. His hooves landed solid on the other side, and a cheer broke from somewhere in the stands. Sarah's throat tightened, but she urged him on. They reached the ramp, the final test. He placed one hoof, then another, trembling as the wood creaked beneath him. The crowd held its breath. Cole's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "He'll never make it." Sarah ignored him, her palm firm against Shadow's shoulder. "You can," she whispered. "We can." Shadow hesitated, his body shaking with effort, then pushed forward. Step by step, he climbed the ramp, his limp evident, but his will unbroken. At the top, he stopped. Ears pricked, chest heaving. The crowd erupted, a roar of disbelief and awe. For a moment, Sarah forgot the pain, the fire, the laughter. All she saw was Shadow, standing tall, against every doubt, every cruelty, every attempt to erase him. She raised her hand, tears streaming down her cheeks, and the arena shook with applause. Even Daniel clapped, his face wet, though he made no effort to hide it. Eli jumped up and down, shouting, "That's my sister! That's Shadow!" Grace sketched furiously, her hands shaking. Harris only nodded, his lips pressed tight, but his eyes gleamed with pride. Shadow descended the ramp slowly, his limp plain, but the cheers followed him. Sarah led him from the arena, her chest heaving with relief. She looked up into the stands, straight at Cole, whose smile had vanished. His stallion had been flawless, but perfection could not match resilience. The judges conferred, their voices low, their faces serious. When the announcer returned, his voice carried clear and strong. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we have witnessed not just recovery, but courage, and for that, we award the top honor of the Rehabilitation Showcase to Sarah Miller and Shadow." The grandstands thundered. Sarah pressed her face against Shadow's mane, sobbing with joy, her tears wetting his silver coat. Around her, the world blurred into cheers, the sound of justice long denied. Cole turned away, his face twisted with rage, but his power in that moment meant nothing. Shadow had limped into the arena a broken horse. He left it a champion, not because he was flawless, but because he had endured. And Sarah, standing at his side, knew they had won something greater than a ribbon or prize money. They had won back their dignity, their hope, their future. As they stepped into the light of the setting sun, the applause still rolling, Sarah whispered the words she had carried since the auction. "We saved each other, didn't we?" Shadow flicked his ears, his breath warm against her hand, and for the first time, Sarah believed the world finally understood. The fairgrounds glowed under the sinking sun, the cheers still echoing like thunder in Sarah's ears as she led Shadow from the arena. The ribbon fluttered in her hand, but she barely looked at it. The real victory stood beside her, his coat damp with sweat, his sides heaving, his head lifted as though he had never known defeat. Shadow had limped into the showcase carrying every scar, every cruel whisper, every doubt that had been laid on him, and he had walked out a champion. Daniel was the first to meet her at the chute. For a long moment he said nothing, his eyes fixed on the horse, his face unreadable. Then he reached out, resting his calloused hand on Shadow's neck. "You did it," he said quietly, his voice breaking. He looked at Sarah, pride shining through the weariness etched into his features. I was wrong. About him. About you. You didn't throw your future away. You built it. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat aching with emotion. Eli rushed in next, nearly knocking her over as he wrapped his arms around her waist. I told you, Sarah. I told. You! He was a champion! His voice rang with joy so pure it pierced through every shadow that had haunted them. Grace stood nearby, tears streaking her cheeks, clutching her sketchbook to her chest. She laughed through her sobs. I wish I could capture this forever. Not the ribbon, not the applause, but this moment, right here. When everyone finally saw what you saw, even Harris approached, his limp more pronounced after a long day, his gruff expression hiding nothing. He studied Shadow for a long moment, then nodded. He held because you held. Don't forget that. Horses don't win with legs. They win with heart. You gave him the chance to show his eyes softened, a rare glimpse of vulnerability. And maybe you gave me a reason to believe again, too. The crowd outside still buzzed with the story. Strangers approached to shake Sarah's hand, to pat Shadow's flank, to marvel at what they had witnessed. Some spoke in awe, others in shame for the whispers they had once spread. For every laugh Sarah had endured, there were now voices lifted in respect, but not everyone celebrated. Across the arena, Cole Whitmore stood rigid, his fists clenched, his smile gone. His stallion gleamed, perfect and flawless, yet forgotten in the wake of Shadow's imperfect triumph. For once, Cole had no words, no sneer. The crowd that had once bent toward him now turned away. Sarah caught his gaze for a heartbeat, and in that silence, she knew she had beaten more than a boy and his horse. She had beaten the arrogance of a family that thought they could burn, mock, and break without consequence. When the evening wound down, the Miller family walked together back to the trailer. The ribbon hung loosely in Sarah's hand, the weight of it light compared to the steady warmth of Shadow beside her. Eli chattered non-stop. Grace scribbled furiously in her sketchbook, and Daniel walked quietly, his silence no longer heavy with disappointment, but with pride. Back at the farm that night, the new barn glowed under the lanterns, its beams strong and unyielding. Sarah led Shadow inside, his hooves steady against the wooden floor. The air smelled of hay and home, no trace of fire, only the promise of tomorrow. She removed his halter and let him rest, then stayed by his side long after the others had gone to bed. She sat in the straw, her back against the stall wall, listening to Shadow's breathing slow as he drifted into sleep. The events of the day swirled in her mind. The cheers, the applause, the moment at the top of the ramp when the world had held its breath. She thought of the girl who had stood at the auction, clutching a coffee tin full of crumpled bills, mocked for believing in a horse no one else wanted. That girl felt like another lifetime, yet she knew she was still that same girl, only now the world had seen what she had carried all along. Everyone thinks I saved you, she whispered into the dark, her voice trembling with exhaustion and joy. But the truth is, you saved me. You gave me something to fight for when I was losing myself. You reminded me that broken doesn't mean worthless. It means worth saving. Shadow shifted in his sleep, his ears flicking, as if he understood. Sarah reached out, brushing her hand along his neck, her heart steady for the first time in years. Outside, The Oklahoma night spread wide and endless, the stars sharp against the dark. The farm was still humble, the debts still real, the future still uncertain. But beneath that vast sky, Sarah knew they had already won the most important battle. They had turned doubt into proof, pain into purpose, ashes into hope. And as she finally drifted into sleep against the sound of shadows breathing, she carried one truth above all. Champions are not born perfect. They are made in fire, in scars, in the unyielding courage to continue. Shadow was proof. And so was she. And that was the story of a girl and a broken horse who rose from ashes to glory. Now, I want to hear from you. If you believe in second chances, just drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe, because the next stories will take you on even more unforgettable journeys of humans and animals that will touch your heart.